A top employee thought he could humiliate a woman at work. What he didn't know. She was the CEO's wife, and his life was about to flip upside down. This story is proof that karma doesn't miss. You won't believe how a single can of Coke destroyed someone's career in seconds. It was a regular Tuesday morning at one of the top tech companies in New York. The office buzzed with the usual activity. Meetings being scheduled, coffee machines humming, keyboards clacking away. The sun had barely made its way through the floor-to-ceiling windows when the day began to unfold in a way no one expected. Everyone knew who Mark was. He had been with the company for nearly 5 years. Tall, sharp-suited, and sharp-tongued, he was one of the top performers, the guy who always got results, brought in major clients, and never missed a sales target. He walked through the halls like he owned them. Colleagues admired his success but whispered behind his back about how full of himself he could be. To Mark, everyone else was just background noise. That morning, Mark strolled into the break room, eyes glued to his phone as usual. Probably checking emails or his fantasy football league, no one really knew. A woman was already inside, quietly making coffee. She was neatly dressed, professional, and carried herself with a calm confidence. She wasn't familiar to most of the employees. Perhaps she was new, or maybe from a different department. As Mark moved toward the fridge, the woman stepped slightly to the side to make room, but in doing so, her shoulder lightly brushed his arm. It was nothing major. A normal human-level accident in a shared space. She turned, offered a polite smile, and said, "Sorry," in a soft but clear voice. Mark didn't even look up. He scoffed, muttered something that sounded like "watch it," and opened the fridge with more force than necessary. He pulled out a cold can of Coke. The woman, thinking the moment had passed, turned back toward her coffee. Then, in a move that shocked everyone present, Mark turned toward her and casually tossed the can at her back. Yes, he threw it. It wasn't a full-speed, aggressive throw, but it was deliberate. The can bounced off her shoulder and clattered to the floor. The sound echoed in the small break room like a thunderclap. Silence fell. Even the hum of the vending machine seemed to pause. The few employees present stopped mid-sip, mid-sentence, mid-bite. Their eyes darted from the Coke can on the floor to the woman who had been hit. One in turn looked like he wanted to vanish into the wall. Mark, unfazed, gave a small laugh. Not even a real laugh, just one of those smug, dismissive snorts, and said, "Watch where you're going next time." The woman bent down slowly, picked up the can, stood straight again, and turned toward Mark. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't swear. Her expression didn't change. She simply looked at him, looked through him, and said, "That was unnecessary." Mark rolled his eyes and walked out as if nothing had happened. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman he had just disrespected wasn't just another employee. Her name was Danielle Carter, and she wasn't new. In fact, she had been in and out of the company for the past few weeks, observing quietly, asking casual questions, walking the floors, and taking mental notes. Why? Because she was the wife of James Carter, the CEO and founder of the company. And this visit wasn't just a social stop. Danielle was no ordinary spouse. She was a powerhouse in her own right. A former executive in a Fortune 500 company, now semi-retired and working closely with her husband to evaluate the internal dynamics of his growing business. After several reports of workplace culture issues, she had volunteered to get a ground-level perspective. She wanted to see how employees behaved when they didn't think someone was watching. She wasn't supposed to reveal her identity yet. But after this incident, it became clear. Staying silent wasn't an option. Later that day, Mark was called to the 32nd floor, the executive suite. He probably thought it was a meeting to discuss numbers, a promotion, or maybe a presentation. He walked into the glass-walled conference room and stopped short. Sitting at the long table were CEO James Carter and Danielle, the woman from the break room. Mark's face turned pale. For the first time that day, he was speechless. James leaned forward. "Mark, do you know who this is?" Mark nodded slowly. "Yes, now I do." Danielle looked directly at him. "Your behavior this morning was completely unacceptable. And I'm not just saying that as someone married to the CEO. I'm saying that as a professional, as a black woman, and as someone who expected better from this company." Mark tried to defend himself. He called it a joke. He said she overreacted. He blamed the stress of the job. But no excuse could erase what happened. Or the fact that this wasn't the first complaint HR had on file with Mark's name. There had been murmurs for months about how he treated interns, how he dismissed female colleagues, how he spoke over people in meetings. But management had always turned a blind eye because he delivered results. This time there would be no blind eye. Within 24 hours, Mark was suspended. And by the end of the week, he was terminated. Not just for the Coke incident, but for a repeated pattern of disrespectful behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. Word spread fast. Some employees were shocked. Others said it was about time. Danielle returned to the company a week later, this time formally introduced, not as a visitor, but as a consultant on workplace culture and diversity. As for Mark, no one really knows what happened to him after. But his story became a cautionary tale. A reminder that titles and numbers don't make you untouchable. Respect does. And you never know who you're really talking to. Until it's too late. Now here's the twist. No one in the room really knew who the woman was. She had that quiet elegance about her. A kind of calm confidence that made you feel like she belonged, but also made you wonder why you hadn't seen her before. She was dressed sharply but not flashily, and her demeanor was warm but reserved. She wasn't loud or demanding. She moved with intention, spoke only when necessary, and always seemed to be paying close attention to everything around her. That morning, most people in the office assumed she was either a new hire, or maybe someone visiting from another department. A few thought she might be from HR, the kind of person who floats from floor to floor doing assessments or sitting in on training sessions, but no one really knew for sure. That's why when Mark threw the Coke can and it hit her, no one quite knew how to react. Some were frozen in disbelief, unsure whether to intervene, speak up, or just pretend it hadn't happened. There's always that uncomfortable pause when something clearly wrong happens, but no one knows who's going to take the first step. And she didn't make a scene. She didn't gasp or cry. She didn't shout or threaten to report him. She didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she calmly picked up the can, looked Mark dead in the eye and said, "That was unnecessary." It was the kind of response that didn't need volume to carry power. It was controlled, intentional, and it left Mark visibly annoyed. Not because he felt guilty, but because he didn't get the reaction he wanted. He rolled his eyes and left the room with that same arrogance he always carried, probably thinking it was just another insignificant interaction in his day. Probably assuming the woman would go cry to HR or worse, say nothing and just move on. Mark was used to walking away unchallenged. He was used to being protected by his performance record, his confidence, and his ability to manipulate a room with charm when needed. He didn't realize that this time, he had crossed a line that would cost him everything. What Mark didn't know, and what no one in that break room realized, was that the woman he had just casually disrespected was not just some new employee. Her name was Danielle Carter, and she was the wife of James Carter, the CEO and founder of the company, the man who had built the organization from scratch over the past 2 decades, the man whose name was on the boardroom walls, the press releases, and every big achievement the company celebrated. Danielle wasn't just a visitor tagging along with her husband for the day. She was there on purpose. She had a mission, and Mark had just handed her the most valuable insight of her entire visit. Danielle was, in her own right, a highly accomplished executive. She had spent years climbing the ranks in the finance industry, eventually becoming the CFO of a multimillion-dollar firm before stepping away from her role. After years of juggling leadership, motherhood, and marriage, she had decided to take a break. Not to rest, but to redirect her energy into something more meaningful. Her husband had often shared concerns about the company culture. There had been anonymous complaints, subtle HR red flags, and concerns about employee retention. James wanted the truth, and Danielle offered a unique solution. She would go in herself. But not as Mrs. Carter. Danielle chose to enter the company quietly. No announcement. No fancy introductions. She spent her first week observing. She sat in meetings. She ate lunch in the common areas. She chatted with receptionists, interns, and mid-level managers. She watched how people interacted when they didn't know someone important was watching. And what she saw concerned her. There were good people, of course, plenty of them, but there was also a sense of hierarchy, of favoritism, of unchecked ego. And at the center of that, she noticed a few key individuals who seemed to operate with a different set of rules. Mark was one of them. She'd heard about him before. even before stepping foot in the building. James had mentioned his numbers were impressive, but that he had received several minor complaints over the years, always swept under the rug because, as it often goes, top talent is hard to replace. Danielle had paid close attention to that name. She didn't go looking for a confrontation, but she also didn't avoid it. When it finally happened, she was prepared to respond not as someone demanding respect because of her status, but as someone standing up for basic human decency. What Mark didn't realize was that his reaction, the smirk, the eye roll, the dismissiveness, confirmed everything she feared about certain corners of the company's culture. And in that moment, she knew her cover would have to be lifted. She hadn't planned on revealing who she was so soon, but some moments force you to change course. This was one of them. Danielle didn't rush to tell her husband. She let the incident sit for a few hours. She watched how others reacted. She watched the whispers in the hallway. Some looked embarrassed. Some pretended it hadn't happened. And one or two employees even came to quietly ask if she was okay. That said a lot. When she finally did tell James that evening at home, he didn't explode with anger. He just listened. Listened carefully, quietly. And then he asked her a single question. "What do you want to do?" She thought for a moment and answered, "I want to do what we said we'd do, fix the culture. From the inside." And that's when everything started to change. Later that afternoon, Mark was called into the CEO's office. His phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Meeting with J. Carter 3 p.m. Mark glanced at it and smirked. He assumed it was about the new account he had landed last week. A six-figure deal that had made him the top performer for the third quarter in a row. He straightened his tie, ran a hand through his hair, and walked through the glass doors of the executive floor with his usual cocky stride. He greeted the executive assistant with a wink and a wish me luck, as if he were heading in to accept an award. She didn't respond. Her expression was unreadable. Mark pushed the door open and walked into the spacious modern office. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in golden afternoon light. But what made him stop mid-step wasn't the view. It was who was sitting at the table. CEO James Carter sat at the head, his expression as still and cold as marble. But next to him, calmly poised and equally unreadable, was the woman from the break room. The woman he had thrown the Coke can at just hours earlier. Danielle Carter. Mark's smirk vanished instantly. His eyebrows lifted in confusion, then panic began to flicker in his eyes as realization dawned. The polished confidence he always carried began to crack. For a moment no one said anything. The silence pressed down on the room like a weight. James Carter didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up. He simply looked Mark in the eye and asked, "Do you know who this woman is?" Mark's lips parted, but no words came out. He nodded slightly, swallowing hard. James continued, "This is my wife, Danielle Carter. And today you assaulted her in front of multiple employees." The word assaulted hit like a brick. Mark opened his mouth to protest, to explain, to spin the situation the way he had spun so many others. But for once, his usual charm failed him. It was a joke," he stammered. "I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a misunderstanding. You know how things can get. Break room, morning rush." Danielle leaned forward slightly, hands folded on the table, voice calm but unshakably firm. "It wasn't a joke," she said. "Let's be very clear about that. It was disrespect. It was aggressive. And whether I'm the CEO's wife or not, no one, absolutely no one, should be treated like that at work." Her words hung in the air. Mark looked to James for support, but none came. There was no "maybe we're being too harsh" look. No sense of leniency. Just calm disappointment, which somehow cut deeper than anger ever could. "I didn't even throw it that hard," Mark mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper now. "She was standing right there. I thought we were just, I thought she—" "You didn't know who she was," James said flatly, finishing the thought for him. "And that's exactly the problem." Mark was silent. "You assumed she was beneath you," James continued. "Someone you could humiliate without consequence. Someone who didn't matter. Someone you didn't have to treat with basic human decency. If she had been an intern or a junior employee, would you have apologized then?" Mark said nothing. His breathing was shallow. His gaze dropped to the table. Danielle spoke again. "I've been in this building for 2 weeks. I've observed a lot. There are good people here, hard-working, respectful people. But there's a rot too. A culture that allows men like you to climb the ladder while stomping over everyone else. I didn't mean it that way, Mark whispered, trying again. It wasn't personal. It's always personal to the person on the other end, Danielle said. Especially when they don't have power. Especially when no one else speaks up for them. James leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Mark, I'll be honest with you, he said. You've made this company a lot of money. You've closed big deals. But success doesn't excuse abuse. I've ignored the warning signs for too long. The HR complaints, the gossip, the turnover in your department. You've created an environment of fear and disrespect. And today you crossed the line in a way that can't be brushed aside. Mark opened his mouth again but stopped himself. He could see it in James's eyes. This was final. There would be no negotiation. No damage control. No second chance. This isn't just about you throwing a can of Coke, James added. This is about the message that sends to the entire company. If we let it slide, what are we saying to everyone else who's been mistreated here? The question hung there like a challenge and Mark had no answer. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was definitive. I need you to pack up your things, James said. You'll receive an email from HR by the end of the day with next steps. Security will escort you out. Mark looked up as if about to argue, but then dropped his gaze again, nodding slowly. He stood up. His footsteps were heavy as he left the room. No words. No goodbyes. Just like that, the man who thought he was untouchable walked out of the office he believed he ruled, with nothing but a cardboard box and a ruined reputation. After he left, Danielle turned to James. He's not the only one. There's more under the surface. I know, James replied. We'll fix it. Together. And in that quiet office, a shift had begun. Not just in leadership but in accountability. Within hours of the confrontation in the CEO's office, HR was looped in. Danielle didn't demand anything extravagant or reactionary. Just a formal investigation into what had happened. She knew that if this moment was going to spark real change, it needed to be handled by the book. The HR director, who hadn't yet been made aware of Danielle's true identity, acted quickly. Witnesses were contacted, statements were collected, and the break room security footage was reviewed. The video showed everything. Mark walking in, the brief interaction near the coffee machine, the Coke can flying through the air, and the stunned silence that followed. There was no ambiguity, no way to frame it as an innocent joke or a misunderstanding. The footage didn't lie, and neither did the reactions of the people in the room. The HR team was shocked, not just by the incident itself, but by the nonchalance with which Mark had walked away from it. His behavior didn't reflect a one-time lapse in judgment. It revealed a deep sense of entitlement, a belief that he could act however he wanted without consequence. When they began digging further into his personnel file, things got even more concerning. Buried beneath praise for his performance and glowing reviews from upper management were warning signs. 2 unresolved complaints from interns about being treated disrespectfully. A written note from a junior colleague who claimed she was consistently interrupted, belittled, and publicly embarrassed by Mark in meetings. One case where a new employee had quit after just 6 weeks on Mark's team, citing a toxic work environment, in her exit interview. None of it had been thoroughly investigated. The company had chalked it up to personality differences, communication styles, or, most commonly, Mark just being a little intense because he's passionate about results. But now no one could ignore the pattern. By that same evening, Mark was placed on administrative leave pending a final review. His access to systems was restricted. He was asked not to return to the office. 2 days later, a formal termination letter was sent to his personal email. The message was clear. Being a top performer doesn't excuse bad behavior. Word of Mark's firing spread through the company faster than a group email. Employees whispered about it at their desks, in Slack channels, over after-work drinks. Some were stunned. Mark had been a star for so long. A few asked if maybe the company had overreacted. But those who had worked closely with him knew the truth, and they weren't surprised. Mark always thought he was untouchable, one longtime employee said quietly to her team. I guess he finally touched the wrong person. But the bigger surprise wasn't Mark's fall. It was Danielle's rise. Now that her identity was no longer a secret, Danielle stepped forward not just as the CEO's wife, but as someone with the authority, experience, and passion to drive change from within. She wasn't interested in being a figurehead. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Danielle held a town hall meeting where she introduced herself formally and addressed the elephant in the room. She told the story, not to humiliate Mark, but to shine a light on what the company had been ignoring. She made it clear that this wasn't about revenge, but about responsibility. She spoke with clarity and empathy, and people listened. Then she got even more hands-on. She met with HR leadership to audit complaint handling procedures and pushed for a system where every complaint would be taken seriously, no matter who the subject was. She partnered with department heads to review team dynamics and identify problem areas. She even created anonymous channels where employees could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Danielle knew that company culture wasn't something you fixed with a single email or workshop. It had to be reshaped from the ground up, through consistent action, honest communication, and leadership that actually lived by the values it claimed to promote. One of her first initiatives was training. Not the usual checkbox-style seminars, but interactive, scenario-based sessions that tackled real workplace issues like bias, microaggressions, and toxic behavior. Teams discuss real-life situations. They practice what accountability looked like. They learned how to call out misconduct without fear. She also instituted something new: culture audits. Every quarter, employees would anonymously assess their team's environment. Not just how productive it was, but how respectful, inclusive, and fair it felt. The data would be reviewed not just by HR but by senior leadership and tied to manager evaluations. And slowly, something began to shift. People who had once kept their heads down started speaking up. Junior staff who had been afraid to challenge senior voices began to find their footing. Even managers who had previously dismissed culture stuff as fluff started listening a little more carefully in meetings. There was resistance, of course. Not everyone liked the changes. A few veteran employees complained that the company had become too sensitive or too politically correct. Danielle didn't argue with them. She simply pointed to the data: better retention, fewer complaints, and more collaboration across teams. Eventually, the results spoke for themselves. The company didn't just fix a broken culture, it began to thrive because of the fix. Innovation returned. People took creative risks without fear of being shot down. Trust was rebuilt slowly but surely. As for Danielle, she didn't make a big show of staying permanently. After 6 months of helping lead the transformation, she transitioned to a formal advisory role and brought in a full-time culture and equity officer to carry the work forward. But her presence lingered. In every new policy, every shift in tone, every time someone paused before acting out of ego or arrogance. Because what started with a Coke can wasn't really about a drink. It was about power, about respect, about what happens when someone finally says, "Enough." And it became a turning point not just for one company, but for everyone who believed they were too important to be held accountable. This story isn't just about a thrown Coke can. It might sound like a small petty moment, one person acting out in a break room, a soda can tossed in frustration or arrogance. But when you look deeper, when you pull back the layers, you realize it was never just about the Coke. It was about something far more important. It was about respect, the kind that every single person deserves, no matter their title, background, appearance, race, or gender. At its core, this is a story about how a moment of disrespect exposed an entire culture that had been silently tolerating behavior like Mark's for far too long. Mark wasn't just a bad apple. He was a product of a system that had allowed ego, status, and numbers to outweigh basic decency. He was protected by his reputation as a top performer, someone who brought in the big clients and consistently delivered. And because of that, people looked the other way when he made inappropriate comments, when he interrupted others in meetings, when he dismissed people he thought were beneath him. Mark believed he could get away with it because up until that day he always had. He assumed that power meant immunity, that delivering results meant the rules didn't apply to him. And when he threw that Coke can, it wasn't just a physical action, it was a message. It said, "I don't have to respect you." It said, "I can humiliate you and there will be no consequences." It said, "You don't matter." But he didn't realize who he was talking to. He didn't realize that the woman he had just disrespected had more influence than anyone else in the building. He didn't know that she had been watching, not just him but the entire culture. He didn't know that she had the power, the voice, and the conviction to make real changes, not just in response to what he did, but in response to the quiet, overlooked problem she had seen building for years. Danielle Carter didn't react with rage. She didn't storm out or escalate the situation in the heat of the moment. She responded with calm, quiet dignity, the kind of strength that doesn't need to raise its voice. She made it clear that what had happened wasn't acceptable, not because of who she was married to, but because of what it meant for every employee who had ever felt small, dismissed, or disrespected in that office. She could have let it go. She could have walked away quietly and handled the matter behind closed doors. But she understood that this wasn't just about her. It was about the message it would send to every other employee watching. If Mark got away with it again, what would that say to the people who had already been hurt by him? What would it say to the next person he decided to target? So she acted, not out of revenge but out of principle. And when her identity was revealed, it wasn't about flexing her connection to power. It was about forcing people to reckon with how they had behaved when they thought no one important was watching. Because the truth is, everyone deserves to be treated with respect. Not just the CEO's wife. Not just someone with a big title or impressive resume. Everyone. That's what Mark failed to understand. He thought status was everything. He assumed that the people who mattered would always be obvious, wearing suits, giving orders, attending executive meetings. He didn't realize that real influence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it walks quietly, observes patiently, and only reveals itself when the moment calls for it. And let's be honest, even if Danielle hadn't been the CEO's wife, his behavior would still have been wrong. It shouldn't take someone's personal connection to power to demand basic decency. Throwing a Coke can at someone, no matter the circumstances, isn't a joke. It's not funny. It's aggressive. It's humiliating. It's the kind of thing that says, I can get away with this because I'm important and you're not. That's the part that stings the most, the idea that there are still people walking into offices every day thinking they can measure someone's worth based on appearances, assumptions, or their place on the organizational chart. But if this story teaches us anything, it's this. You never really know who you're talking to. You never know what battles they've fought, what influence they hold, or what power they carry quietly behind the scenes. And more importantly, you never know what your actions say about you until they're put under a microscope. Every moment you choose to treat someone poorly, every snide remark or thoughtless action, it becomes a reflection, not of the person you're targeting but of who you are. Because real character isn't revealed in board meetings or sales reports. It's revealed in break rooms, in passing interactions, in how you treat people who have nothing to offer you. It's easy to be kind to your boss. It's easy to be respectful when someone has a title. But how do you act when you think the person in front of you doesn't matter? That's what this story is really about. Respect isn't something you turn on and off depending on who's watching. It's a value, a habit, a choice. And when you choose it consistently, you don't just make the workplace better, you make yourself better. You create an environment where people feel safe, seen, and valued. And you hold others, especially those with power, to a higher standard. So the next time you're tempted to roll your eyes at a colleague, dismiss someone's input, or act out of frustration, stop. Take a breath. Think, because that person you're brushing off, they might be the CEO's wife, or they might be someone who just needed to know they mattered that day. Either way, they deserve your respect. And your actions will always speak louder than your words. If you found this story as shocking as we did, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you love real workplace drama and powerful life lessons, make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.